Rome's dominion was not established solely on the basis of fortitude. It was constructed using debt. We enjoy imagining the Roman legions as unstoppable combatants, driven by honor and discipline. However, the supply chain underpinning each polished helmet and sharpened gladius was of an astonishingly complex and expensive nature. Food, weapons, roads, and compensation were required by thousands of men. Horses required sustenance. Timber and labor were required for the construction of siege armaments. And all of it necessitated financial resources, a substantial amount of it. Therefore, how did Rome finance centuries of conquest? Additionally, why is it still relevant today? The pattern becomes increasingly apparent as one delves deeper into the Roman war mechanism. War was not exclusively waged on the battlefield. It was intrinsically linked to the financial system. The system was unable to halt once it was in motion. However, expansion was not an option. It was an economic necessity. Does this sound familiar? Rome's military was a citizen militia during the early Republic. You could be conscripted if you possessed land. The soldiers were anticipated to return to their farms following the campaign, and they carried their own armaments. However, the Republic's expansion increased the duration of conflicts and their distance from the homeland. The antiquated models began to malfunction. You were no longer able to simply take a spear and depart for a year. Professional soldiers were required. Rome initiated the process of centralizing military financing at that time. The state initiated the payment of stipends to its soldiers. Only a small amount, but sufficient to maintain their loyalty. Then, the genuine turning point occurred. Conquest itself evolved into a revenue model. New taxes, new captives, new gold mines, and new tribute were associated with each new province. The cycle was self-reinforcing. Additional warfare was financed by conflict. However, this is the point at which the situation becomes both intriguing and perilous. Taxation was not Rome's sole source of revenue. It depended largely on borrowing. The Republic took out substantial public loans from the affluent elite, particularly the equities, Rome's burgeoning financial class. During lengthy or costly conflicts, such as the Punic conflicts between Rome and Carthage, these contributions were not patriotic. They were investments. In the newly subjugated territories, these investors anticipated returns in the form of tax farming rights, interest payments, and business monopolies. Consequently, war was transformed into a business. And the more profitable it was, the more war was declared as Rome began. Does this sound familiar? Everything was transformed by this militarized economy as time progressed. Generals who could guarantee rewards were granted political authority. In an act of violence, senators were turned into proprietors. The publicani, who were private contractors, were responsible for managing logistics and tax collection, thereby generating substantial profits. It was military-industrial capitalism in a toga, and the expenses they accrued. The state was compelled to continuously generate new revenue in order to satisfy its obligations to combatants and creditors. When the pace of conquests faltered or the treasury was depleted by uprisings, Rome employed the oldest tactic in the book, debasing the currency. The silver content of the denarius was gradually diminished, beginning with Emperor Nero. In the subsequent 2 centuries, emperors continued to dilute the coin, transforming it from a dependable silver coin into a thin pledge that was supported by nothing. Subsequently, inflation occurred. The level of confidence was lowered. Rome's monetary system was in freefall by the 3rd century. Meanwhile, the rich got richer. The senators and stocks protected their wealth, buying land, slaves, and foreign accounts. The elite got tax breaks, backroom deals. The poor had to pay taxes and devalue their currency. The public utility was rendered inoperable. The incidence of corruption increased significantly. The lower classes bore the financial burden of perpetual conflicts. Through inflation, labor levies, and military conscription, this was not merely a military failure. It was a financial matter. Now, take a moment to observe the surroundings of today. Central banks are discreetly debasing currency to cover the shortfall. Governments are running enormous deficits, and wars are funded through borrowing. A financial class that is profiting from defense contracts and crises. A market-based, military, monetary, or expansion-based economy is the sole means of maintaining the system's stability. The DNA is disturbingly familiar, although it is not a precise parallel. Rome teaches us that an economy that is founded on expansion, particularly violent expansion, ultimately encounters a brick wall. There is a dearth of resources to extract, lands to conquer, or adversaries to combat. The system becomes internally focused when this occurs. The obligation persists. The revenue decreases while the expectations persist. This is the point at which the state begins to oppress its own citizens. More control, more currency debasement, and harsher taxation were implemented by Rome. The elite fortified their villas while the multitudes were kept silent by bread and circuses. Does this sound familiar? Currently, the term tribute is not used. It is referred to as monetary policy, quantitative easing, or taxation. However, the mechanics are strikingly similar. Central institutions generate currency. Governments incur greater expenditures than they generate revenue. Assets are acquired by the wealthy. With their incomes decreasing, the impoverished borrowing continues to be the primary source of funding for wars. The United States expended more than $2 trillion on the Afghanistan war. The majority of it was financed through debt. Who is the recipient of the contracts? Who is the recipient of the interest? Who ultimately bears the burden of inflation, diminished services, and volatile currencies? The response is already known to you. Additionally, the cycle is self-sustaining, similar to Rome. You are no longer required to have an emergency in order to print money once debt becomes your default. All you must do is prevent a catastrophe. You normalize the extraordinary. And the longer it persists, the more you are compelled to maintain the illusion that everything is going well until it isn't. This is the reason why economic history is so significant. This is not a collection of old, outdated tales. They are indicators of impending danger. Rome is a state that has delegated an excessive amount of power to private finance, developed an addiction to expansion, devalued its currency, and suffocated its own citizens under the weight of unsustainable obligations. Not because it was malevolent, but rather because the system lacked an off switch. In the present day, we reside in a distinct empire that is digital, global, and driven by capital flows rather than legions. However, the game remains unchanged. Power and money are inextricably linked. The feeble continue to be punished by inflation, and financial fallacies continue to operate until they are dispelled. Therefore, what courses of action are available to you? Begin by observing the pattern, as the majority of individuals are unaware of it. The majority of individuals believe that inflation is unpredictable. Taxes are merely indispensable. Freedom is the result of that expansion may persist indefinitely. However, the Stoics had a term for that: false belief. It is not possible to completely withdraw from the system. However, it is comprehensible. You have the option to cease playing the game without understanding its mechanics. Not only can you cultivate your own resilience through financial resources, but you can also do so through your mentality. This necessitates the examination of financial history rather than merely personal finance. This entails monitoring for indicators of systemic duress rather than merely market speculation. That entails inquiring as to who benefits from my confusion, because you were not intended to be aware of this information. It was improper for you to inquire about the manner in which Rome funded its conflicts, or the manner in which the contemporary state currently achieves this. You were intended to concentrate on the spectacle, the headlines, the GDP, and the distractions rather than the mechanisms and incentives. However, you are now aware. It is impossible to disregard it. Financial education encompasses more than just budgeting and investing. It is a matter of comprehending power, comprehending systems, and discerning the illusion of stability. Therefore, the next time you learn about a new conflict, stimulus, or crisis, do not merely adhere to the money. Inquire as to who is responsible for lending, earning, and ultimately paying. Because if history teaches us anything, it is this: empires do not collapse when the adversary penetrates the gate. Their collapse occurs when the mathematics ceases to function. And no one is willing to address the issue. If this has given you a new perspective, then please press subscribe. The answers are in history. I will show you the right place. You will see.